It was May of 1818, and the relentless sun beat down upon the gravel drive of Havelock Hall. Genevieve Havelock sat at the morning table, her posture as straight as the iron spine of the gatehouse, a small silver teaspoon resting against the porcelain edge of her teacup. She was 22 years old, and the lace at her cuffs was frayed just enough to tell a story of neglect she refused to acknowledge aloud. Me conta nos comentários de onde você está ouvindo esta história. A cidade, a hora. Eu leio cada um, e se estas histórias de duques e ladies fazem seu coração respirar mais devagar, deixa o seu inscrito aqui. É o meu jeito silencioso de saber que você voltou. Esta é uma obra de ficção ambientada na Inglaterra da Regência. Personagens, nomes e situações são inteiramente imaginários. Qualquer semelhança com pessoas ou eventos reais é mera coincidência. The correspondence had begun as a formality, a series of inquiries regarding the lease of the North Lot, a parcel of land that sat like a splinter in the side of the vast Stanhall estate. Adrian Stanhall, the Duke of Stanhall, was a man whose reputation was built on the terrifying architecture of his silence. He was a man who moved through the drawing rooms of Mayfair with the expression of someone who was constantly calculating the weight of a silence before he dared to break it. For months, Genevieve had sent letters detailing the yields of the wheat, the repair of the fences, and the mounting pressure of the land taxes, £72 and 4 shillings due by the Michaelmas quarter. She had written with the earnestness of a woman trying to preserve a legacy. He had responded with nothing, not a word, not a nod. Just the cold, indifferent arrival of the next month's rent, paid in full, as if the money were a barricade he was building to keep her from ever needing to speak to him again. The reconstruction of her life began not with a grand gesture, but with the quiet realization that the North Lot was no longer a burden she had to carry alone. She spent her afternoons in the library, a space defined by the tall, narrow windows that looked out over the sunken garden, watching the shadows lengthen across the worn mahogany floor. Havia algo na forma, como a luz batia naqueles livros esquecidos, que a fazia sentir-se uma estranha em sua própria casa. She began to pack the records. She began to set aside the ledgers. She moved through the house with the focused grace of someone preparing for an exile she had chosen for herself. By the end of June, the conviviality of the season had reached its zenith, and the social dances were as stifling as the heat. In the crowded ballrooms, Genevieve watched the Duke from the other side of the dance floor. He was a figure of rigid, dark elegance, navigating the room with the expression of one who was performing a duty rather than attending a celebration. They did not dance. They did not speak, yet she found him watching her, not with the intensity of a suitor, but with the curiosity of a man studying a clock that had suddenly, inexplicably, stopped ticking. One evening, after a dinner where the silver cutlery felt heavy and cold in her hand, she found him near the conservatory. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, and the silence between them was a living, breathing thing. He stood by the arched doorway, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere between the glass panes and her own steady gaze. "The greenhouse temperature has been poorly managed," he said, his voice a low, measured resonance that seemed to vibrate against the glass. It was not a greeting, nor was it a rebuke. It was an observation, delivered with the cadence of a man who had spent hours memorizing the exact phrasing of his indifference. Genevieve tightened her grip on her lace handkerchief, her knuckles turning the color of bone. She did not look away. She did not shrink. "The staff is preoccupied with the harvest, Your Grace. It is a matter of priorities." He remained still, a shadow against the moonlight. "Priorities," he repeated, the word tasting of iron in the air. "It is a heavy burden, managing a legacy that the world has already decided to divide." He knew. He knew about the secret clause in her father's will, the one that necessitated the sale of the North Lot if the estate failed to meet its yield. He knew that by ignoring her letters, he had been slowly starving her of the information she needed to save her home. It was a tactical, cold-blooded maneuver, or perhaps she thought it was something else entirely. Havia algo naquela pausa que não era apenas frieza. Era uma forma de proteção que ela ainda não conseguia decifrar. The tension peaked in July, when Lady Serena Price, a woman whose vanity was as vast as her dowry, made a point of announcing her engagement to the Duke in the center of the crowded assembly rooms. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Genevieve felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the expectant, hungry silence that follows a social execution. She did not flinch. She did not reach for her fan. She simply smoothed the silk of her glove, her expression the precise, practiced containment of a woman who had already anticipated the storm and had built her house to withstand it. She chose dignity. She gave a slight, formal nod, the barest acknowledgement of a reality that no longer held dominion over her heart. The Duke watched her from across the room. For a fraction of a second, the mask of his composure slipped. There was a flicker of something raw, something that looked remarkably like panic, before he turned his back on the room and walked out into the cool, dark air of the night. The following morning, Genevieve began the final dismantling of her father's study. She was finished. She had written her last letter, a brief, sterile notification that she would vacate Havelock Hall by the end of the week. She was folding the parchment when the sound of a horse, ridden at a breakneck, desperate pace, tore through the stillness of the early morning. It was a sound that defied the decorum of the hour. It was the sound of a man who had ridden through the night, through the mist and the mud, driven by a realization that had come far too late. She heard the heavy thud of boots on the gravel, then the aggressive, impatient rhythm of the knocker against the oak door. She did not rush. She took her time, smoothing her skirts, checking the ribbon in her hair. When she opened the door, the Duke of Stanhall stood there, his coat soaked with dew, his breathing ragged, his face a mask of exhaustion and something that looked dangerously like hope. He did not ask to come in. He did not offer an apology. He simply looked at the stacks of trunks in the hallway, his eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. "The North Lot payments," he began, his voice breaking the silence of the foyer, "were never meant to be a silence. They were an attempt to keep the creditors from looking at your books. I thought if I held the land, I could hold the storm at bay until you were ready." Genevieve looked at him, seeing the man behind the title for the first time, a man who had been terrified of his own shadow, terrified of the responsibility of a heart he didn't know how to steward. She did not say that she had been ready for months. She did not say that the silence had almost broken her. "The greenhouse is cold, Your Grace," she said, her voice soft, steady, and entirely in control. "The harvest is done. There is nothing left to hold." He took a step toward her, his hand hesitating in the air before he let it fall to his side. "The books are yours, Genevieve. Everything in them. I am not here to offer you a contract. I am here because I have finished the only book that ever truly mattered, and I find I cannot turn the final page." She looked at him, and for the first time she saw the man, not the Duke. She saw the years of solitary nights, the weight of the expectations that had carved his features into a rigid, impenetrable stone. She felt the sudden, terrifying pull of a future that had not been written in any ledger. She did not reach for his hand. She did not offer a grand declaration of forgiveness. She simply stepped aside, opening the door wider to the light of the morning. "Then you had better come in," she said, her voice a whisper that sounded like a vow. "The tea is getting cold." She walked back toward the library, her footsteps silent on the rug. He followed her, the sound of his boots echoing against the floorboards, a rhythm that finally, after all these months, matched her own. She returned to her book. The Rain continued. Histórias contadas com amor sereno. Uma carta sem data chegou, trazendo um peso que o outono guardou. Uma dívida, um nome que a cidade temia, do que ninguém entendia. Ela dobrou o medo em silêncio, escolheu o caminho que ninguém quis ver. Foi assim, sem prometer nada, que dois estranhos se encontraram no frio. Ele, o homem que Londres julgava errado. Ela, a mulher que aprendeu a confiar de novo. Uma carta sem data chegou, trazendo um peso que o outono guardou. Uma dívida, um nome que a cidade temia, do que ninguém entendia. Ela dobrou o medo em silêncio, escolheu o caminho que ninguém quis ver. Foi assim, sem prometer nada, que dois estranhos se encontraram no frio. Ele, o homem que Londres julgava errado. Ela, a mulher que aprendeu a confiar de novo. Se histórias assim te acompanham na noite, deixa um comentário e um inscrito. É o que faz elas continuarem sendo contadas aqui. Esta é uma obra de ficção ambientada na regência inglesa. Qualquer semelhança com pessoas ou eventos reais é pura coincidência.